Starfish Education. This is part 2 of how to develop student-centered design challenges. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to see if your idea is aligned to the standards that you need to teach, what students will actually do during the challenge that you're creating, how we're going to use motivation and engagement to achieve higher learning, and what success looks like from a solution standpoint. First, before we go any further, we're going to talk a little bit about standards. It's really important to make sure that your idea is solidly aligned with the standards before proceeding. If it isn't, then it might not be something that you can use in your classroom. And you want this challenge to be something that you can build on year over year. So the first important step is making sure that it has a solid foundation and checking your standards like NGSS, Next Generation Science Standards, and CCSS, Common Core State Standards, is the first step. You'll also want to check other standards that you may be required to teach, such as statewide standards and/or district-wide standards as well. Next, we're going to talk about what students will actually do in this design challenge that you've created. So what that lends itself to is crafting a really good statement that allows kids to see a couple things. First of all, it's going to help them see what kind of solution that they're looking to work towards. For example, if something's going to be the fastest, or have to go the longest distance, or stay aloft the longest, or be the slowest. So it kind of gives them a parameter within which to work. The second thing that you'll want to make sure to do is to make sure that it is both clear, and the third thing, that it is short. So it will be one statement. For example, with Inky the Octopus that we talked about in the last video, the example statement for Inky the Octopus might look something like, students will work with a team to build a habitat that will keep Inky safe. In that one statement, I've told you a lot of things. First of all, it's short, it's clear, it's concise. I've sort of told you a little bit about the scenario. I've told you that it involves Inky, and I've told you what a successful solution will look like in this case, that you need to construct a habitat for Inky that will keep him safe. So your challenge statement doesn't have all of your criteria and constraints in it, which we'll get to in a second, but it does tell students briefly what they're about to do. After designing your challenge statement, you'll want to think about how that's going to help motivate and engage students. So for example, what are you actually going to have them do? In my example, I'm going to have students design and create a habitat that will keep Inky safe. But what will students actually need to do in order to arrive upon a solution? Well, in my example, students are going to need to know about an octopus. They're going to need to know what kind of habitat an octopus lives in. They're going to need to know how smart they are. They're actually very clever, and so students are going to need to build that into their design. After we've developed our design challenge statement, it naturally lends itself into talking about the criteria and constraints for a project. So the difference between criteria and constraints is that criteria is basically something that you need to have, and constraints are basically something that you need to not have or not do. So let's talk about criteria. For the Inky example, for some piece of criteria, what I might say is that I want the trainers to be able to access Inky easily. So therefore, Inky's habitat needs to have a lid. I might also say that I want tourists to be able to clearly see Inky. So that would lend itself to the criteria of having some sort of habitat that allows tourists to be able to easily view Inky. On the constraints side, we're going to talk about things that kids shouldn't do or they can't do. And this is where budget would come into play if you wanted to make that a parameter for a constraint. For my example for Inky, I'm going to make the constraints the size of the habitat. So I'm going to specify how big or how small the habitat needs to be. This helps kids be able to follow rules, and it helps to be able to provide them more of a real life scenario. The last thing that you'll want to think about right now is a little bit of assessment. So we'll get into that in greater detail in one of the other videos. But right now, you should be thinking about how you're going to assess the project. So are you going to have students develop a rubric? Are you going to develop a rubric? Are you going to have students give a presentation along with the container that they've developed? Are you going to have them do a poster? So you want to be thinking about this as we go down the line so that everything fits into place nicely and we don't have to come back and do any rework. Thank you so much for joining me today. Come back soon for part 3 of the series on preparing the challenge. For more STEM tips and resources, visit Starfish Education and sign up to stay connected.